Good morning. My name is John McGlennon. I'm a government professor here at the College of William & Mary, and my specialties are American government. I teach about political parties. I teach about American state and local governments and the American South. I've been teaching here at William & Mary since 1974, the start of the middle of the Watergate scandal. And that means that if you want to do the math quickly, this will be my 47th year of teaching. During that time period, I've had the opportunity to look at about a dozen presidential elections that have come and gone, and I can say with great certainty that the 2020 election is likely to be one of the most unusual elections in the history of American politics. We're going to be talking today about polarization, the pandemic, and participation. Three factors that I think are going to be quite important in terms of understanding the election that's occurring on November 3rd, and in fact, for many voters, has already started. Polarization has been a factor in American politics for a number of years now, but it hasn't always been with us. In the past, we've had periods, especially during the mid to late 20th century, in which polarization was really not very common. Voters often split their party tickets. They indicated that they didn't think the parties had a great deal of difference between them. And generally, if you looked at the nature of political parties, they did tend to hew to a moderate kind of approach. That fit with a model that many political scientists had examined that basically suggested that in our system of election, where a candidate has to get more votes than anybody else, the way in which they competed for those elections was basically to look for voters in the middle who they could convince to switch from one side to the other in a given election. Even in the same election where they might vote for one party's candidate for president and another party's candidate for Congress or the United States Senate. Those days are behind us, at least for the moment. And what we find today is that most American voters are very polarized in their attitudes. Their partisanship affects not only their preference for candidates, but often shapes the way they look at issues and the nature of the electoral process itself. If we look at this chart that's up here, we've got a couple of ways in which we can examine the attitudes of people who have demonstrated fairly strong loyalty, if not just to political party, at least to candidates. Our first two charts basically show us change that has occurred over time between 2016 and 2020 on the question, first of all, of whether voters believe that being white in American society gives you significant advantages. And one of the things you can see from this chart is that people who voted for Hillary Rodham Clinton in 2016 and are planning to vote for Joe Biden in 2020, they're represented by that top blue line. And you can see that there was a significant increase in the number of voters who thought that that was the case, that in fact, being white in America does give you greater advantages. The middle group are all voters, and you can see that those voters as a whole also show a significant increase in the number of people believing that there is a clear white preference that exists in society. But among people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and plan to vote for him in 2020, you can see that there's virtually no change. The numbers move from 4% believing that whites have an advantage to 5%. Similarly, when it's asked if voters feel that blacks have significant disadvantages or problems that are not faced by whites in American society, you see a similar kind of trend. The Clinton-Biden voters show a 17-point increase in the number who say that there is, in fact, a much harder life for blacks in American society than for whites. For all voters, there's also a change that is not quite as steep, but still significant. But among Trump voters, it's actually a decline in the number of people who take that stand. We also see this kind of change, but in a slightly different way when we think about the evaluation of particular groups or beliefs. And we can see, first of all, that when Americans were asked about the question of whether Islam as a religion has more tendency toward violence than other religions, that all groups reported a decline in belief in that attitude, but certainly there are sharp differences among Democratic voters, all voters, and Trump voters. And finally, when we look at the question of immigration, are newcomers to American society contributing a lot? Again, everybody says yes, but the degree to which they say yes varies tremendously. So we've seen this kind of change, this kind of orientation of polarization very clearly in American politics in recent years. But we also know that it goes much deeper than this. And the dissatisfaction, the distaste of one party's members for another's has really reached a tremendously high level, even to the point where many voters of one political party say they would not date somebody from the other party or who supports the candidates of the other party. And we found in 2016 that Republicans were more likely to give a favorable rating to Vladimir Putin than to Hillary Clinton. However, there's still a belief among Americans that there ought to be compromise, but polarization has even affected that. When we see on this chart the question of whether Americans believe that it's important for elected officials to compromise with each other in order to reach outcomes for public policy and to the benefit of the public, there's a fairly consistent and high level of agreement that we ought to have this compromise. But what exactly does it mean? Well, what we find is that among Republicans, the idea is that compromise really involves Democrats giving in to Republican perspectives. And among Democrats, quite the opposite applies. The compromise really means that Republicans ought to be more willing to accept Democratic positions. In a situation like that, the idea of compromise really loses much of its appeal and helps to explain why we've gone through so much gridlock in Washington in the last several years, and not only in Washington, but virtually at every level of government. This chart shows us something about the behavior of Americans in looking at the question of polarization and how they view the candidates of the other party. We talked about some personal relationships that are affected by the attitudes on polarization. We could talk for just a second about the notion that Americans don't just think that the parties offer different perspectives on what should be done in public policy. They actually view the opposition party in many ways as being a threat to American survival. At an earlier time, that wasn't really true. And what this chart shows are the percentage of voters, starting way back at the beginning of the 20th century, all the way to the present, of the number of voters who would indicate a willingness to vote for, or actually did vote for, a presidential candidate of one party and a congressional candidate of the other. And you can see that we had some high points in the second half of the 20th century. In particular, the 1972 election, in which President Nixon was reelected in a landslide just before the Watergate scandal broke, and where he carried hundreds of congressional districts which elected Democrats to the House. Similarly, Ronald Reagan in his landslide election of 1984 was able to win in many districts even though his party's candidates for the House failed to carry those districts, and we had split government. But that split government generally was able to work out their differences and adopt policies that were acceptable to both sides, if not their ideal policy positions. But today we see a situation where there are very few congressional districts in the country in which the candidate for Congress is going to be elected from the opposite party that carries the presidential race in that district. So that's a really sharp distinction that we can find in presidential politics today compared to the past. So polarization is certainly a part of American politics, and it affects everything that we look at. And when I say that it affects everything we look at, that's part of the way in which we might imagine polarization working. Essentially, once you've come to a determination of which party you belong to, it's like putting on a pair of glasses. And those glasses give you a different way of looking at the world. The glasses give you a kind of perceptual lens that makes the things that you like look even better and the things that you don't like look even worse. This election is important for another reason, though, and that is that it's an election taking place during a pandemic. And this is not something that happens every day. In fact, it's been a century since we've experienced a situation like this, and we really don't have a very good feel for the way in which it affected the politics of the day. COVID-19, of course, has had a big impact, and that impact has been felt in terms of issues, it's been felt in terms of candidates, and it's been felt in terms of impact on the process of politics itself. Think about those perceptual lenses and just think about the different ways in which supporters of President Trump versus supporters of Joe Biden express positions about things like wearing masks, attending rallies, and so forth. And what we can see is that there is a dramatic difference. The pandemic obviously has caused a tremendous change in the 2020 election. One of the things that it has done, of course, is it's brought that issue right to the forefront of the consideration of voters. It's made it very important in their determinations as to how to cast their ballots, and it wasn't really even in the calculations at the end of 2019 as this election was just beginning to get started. Healthcare itself has been a kind of subsidiary issue that has grown as a result. It was crucially important in the 2018 elections that the Democrats won by a substantial margin to take control of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so the pandemic is having an impact on issues and the way in which the election campaign is playing out. At the beginning of this election campaign, it looked like the economy would be an issue that President Trump would stress strongly, and he has been stressing it because it was an area in which he got very high marks from the American public, despite the fact that his approval ratings overall have been fairly low for a president over the entire course of his presidency. They've been very stable, but they've been low. The pandemic has also brought to the fore some other issues. For instance, climate change has emerged as an issue of concern, and partly that's a reflection of the fact that we had a period early on when most states were locked down fairly tightly, and around the world we saw changes in the level of smog, the clarity of the air, the quiet that emerged in many cases, that raised a kind of sense among many people in the United States as well as the rest of the world about what human impact is on climate. And so climate change has really emerged as a more powerful issue as the year has progressed. More recently, we've seen with the wildfires in California, with the nature of the hurricanes that have been coming fast and furious throughout this summer and fall, that climate is likely to continue to be an important concern for many voters. So COVID has been a primary issue, and it's been one on which the public has generally viewed the president's performance negatively. Not the whole public, and especially not Trump supporters, who have tended to view the president's performance as quite strong, and they indicate high levels of satisfaction, and even a strong feeling that maybe there's really not so much to COVID-19 as some critics might charge. And on the other hand, people who are not supporters of the president see his performance as abysmal and feel very strongly that he needs to be replaced. So the focus now is disproportionately on the impact of people of color, on the intersection with the racial justice movement that has been going on in the last several months, protests and conflicts over the George Floyd death. All of those have also come to the fore as part of this coronavirus impact on the presidential election campaign. Overall, it's hard to imagine how this election would not look tremendously different if it had not been for the pandemic, which is affecting just about every other issue that you could imagine. It's also had an impact on candidates. The president's job performance has been hampered by perception by the public that he has not done enough in fighting the pandemic. We know that there has been a receding of the emphasis on the economy, at least as a favorable issue for the president. Americans are still quite concerned about the economy, but many of them are viewing it through the lens of the pandemic and through the lens of criticism of the president. He continues to have his strongest approval on the economy, but the difference between his approval and Joe Biden's approval has declined significantly over the last few months. We know that there is a less favorable rating of the president on the economy, and that he's tried to raise other issues like law and order, on which he feels he would benefit, but they have not really cut very well with the public at large. Both candidates have been restricted by the pandemic as well. President Trump, who we know loves to do rallies, large rallies with lots of people present and closely packed together, has only recently been able to go out and start doing those rallies again. And he is, again, trying to find other ways in which to campaign, which is why he began doing briefings during the summer on a daily basis on the pandemic and its impacts. Joe Biden, on the other hand, has spent much of his time adjusting to virtual campaigning and only recently has started venturing out into the public, and even there continues to practice things like mask wearing, social distancing, encouraging people to take good care in terms of following the medical guidance on the pandemic as a way of contrasting his attitudes and beliefs with the president's. But we've seen that he's had to sort of reinvent the nature of campaigning, and that's part of what's involved with this whole notion of COVID's impact on the political process. We've had a suspension of the campaigns for a while in terms of public activity. Again, they have started coming out in the public once more with rallies, with the events that both candidates have undertaken in strategically placed states around the country. We've seen a shift to virtual campaigning, and that virtual campaigning for Biden was very important because it allowed him to do a lot without having to invest much money or time in travel. And so he's been able to especially produce very good results on fundraising, but also to communicate with lots of different groups from his home base in Delaware. The president, of course, is able to command public attention in many instances just by being president, and he has taken good advantage of that with announcements of new developments on a regular basis at his press conferences and through other activities. When we think about the way in which the COVID pandemic is affecting the politics of the day, nothing stands out more, though, I think, than the virtual conventions that both political parties undertook this past summer. So if we think about the two first items, the polarization that exists in the country and then COVID's impact, they do mesh together because in many instances, what in many other countries would be seen as a more unified perspective on how to address the COVID-19 epidemic, in the United States, there has been much less agreement, much more controversy, and much more likelihood of disputing the basic facts surrounding the pandemic and its impact and the best way to bring it under control. Participation is the third P of our discussion today, and that is that the 2020 presidential election, perhaps in part because of the pandemic, more because of polarization, is producing an intensely activated electorate. Participation in the 2020 election is likely to be quite high. The expectations are that it will set a record, certainly in terms of the number of votes that are cast, but also in terms of the percentage of the voters who turn out, at least one of the highest turnouts in recent history. And of course, the other thing that will be different this year is that many of those voters will be casting their ballots in ways that differ from previous elections. We know that in addition to the high turnout, that the motivation of voters is in part like for candidates, but more heavily dislike for candidates or parties. For the Democrats, it is dislike of President Trump. For the Republicans, it is dislike for the establishment and for the Democratic Party. There is little interest in either party in changing sides, and that's a pretty clear pattern that we see emerging in this election campaign. Overwhelmingly, people are sticking with their party's candidates and indicating that they plan to turn out for that election. Few people say that they are even likely to consider changing their votes between now and Election Day. And there certainly are partisan differences over the methods of voting, with the president sending messages that people ought to be wary of mail ballots and that Democrats have been encouraging voters to get mail ballots and to cast their ballots early, so that we are seeing already votes being cast as of today, over 100,000 votes have already been received in North Carolina, a state that leads the way in terms of starting the early voting process. And we have, of course, a neutering of the possibility of an October surprise, because we may find that by the time that the debates occur between the presidential candidates, that in fact a large percentage of the votes that will ultimately be cast in this election will have already been cast. And that raises the question of when will we know the outcome of the election, with concerns that we won't have the final vote tallied until weeks after Election Day. And I think it's certainly true that the final votes will not be certified until some weeks after Election Day. But in most states, in fact, we will know very clearly, unless the election is exceptionally close, what the results are by election night or certainly the next morning. Most states have now moved in a direction to allow early processing of mail-in ballots and early voting ballots so that they can be added to the election day count, and by midnight local time, we should know in many states who has won or who is a lead that would be insurmountable with the additional ballots to come in. North Carolina, I mentioned just a moment ago, is a state that's already receiving mail ballots. This number was something I put on this PowerPoint slide yesterday. By today, that 865,000 applications for ballots had already risen to 890,000. The corresponding number in 2016, as you can see, was 62,000 yesterday. Today, it would be 65,000. So huge increase in the number of people requesting ballots, and already this number, which was 81,000 as of yesterday, is 101,000. So lots of votes already being cast, and lines today in Virginia, which began an early voting process, were surprising to many people, but we are likely to see those continue for the next several weeks. And it is a partisan difference in terms of using this early voting option. This is North Carolina and shows in the first set of bars the number of registered voters, or the percentage of registered voters who identify with the Democratic Party, which would be the blue, the Republican Party, which is sort of this rust-colored bar, and then the gray bar represents unaffiliated voters. So you can see that there is a difference. Democrats are the largest group, but they are not a majority by any stretch of the imagination. Unaffiliated voters would come second, and then Republicans. In terms of who's requested an absentee ballot, those 890,000 people that I just talked about, Democrats represent a majority of the people who've requested an absentee ballot. Unaffiliated voters are next, and only fewer than 15% of the voters who are Republicans have requested a mail-in ballot. And of those who've already returned them, you can see that the Democrats even perform more strongly. About 55% of all the ballots that have already been received have come from voters who are registered as Democrats. Unaffiliated voters are about 29%, and Republicans trail at about 13%. So just to wrap up what we've looked at here, we see that polarization has certainly had a tremendous impact on the 2020 election, as it has for the last several years. And polarization means that people see the high stakes in the election outcome. They really feel strongly that it matters who wins. We know that there is interest, and that interest is very high and intense among voters for participating in this election. It's not that they may enjoy it, but they feel it is extremely important for them to participate in the election. And we know that as of this week, Joe Biden has a stable lead that has basically been in place for most of the summer and continues into this early part of September. We know that the issues of the pandemic, health care, and the like are at the top of the voters' minds. That the economy is important, but it is a double-edged sword for the president at the moment, even though he retains more popularity on that than on his overall job performance. His advantage over Biden is declining, and he trails significantly on the pandemic and on race relations, climate change, and health care. And the final thing that we know is that every day the window of this election is narrowing. More votes are being cast. Those votes are locked in place, and the parties will be dealing with a much more narrow range of voters. It will turn this election into a contest of mobilization and suppression. Mobilization on the part of a party trying to identify and convince those who support the party to turn out for the election, and suppression in terms of trying to convince supporters of the other candidate that the candidate doesn't have the chance of winning, or that there are things about the candidate that they really might not feel comfortable supporting, and that they might want to just think about staying home for this election. So in terms of the 2020 election, it would be foolish to predict the outcome today, simply because this has been an election campaign that has defied all the conventional norms and traditions of election time. And the intrusion of COVID is just such a major factor that could affect almost everything we know. But there are some things that we have seen, and we know that polarization, the pandemic, and participation will all be critical to the outcome of this race.